Dudut, Cade me Lafalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time once again for our Saturday book. And today's book, I read it in high school. It contributed to the historical knowledge that I was obsessed with about the Holocaust, World War II in general, fascism specifically. And sorry. Thanks to this book and a lot of other first-person narratives, primary source materials, which at the time were very hard to come by. No internet. It was very difficult. And because I'm talking about late 60s, early 70s, just slightly over 20 years after the war in some cases for people, some had not been discovered. They were hidden away. Others were in family attics and not truly hidden, but not revealed yet. Some were not put out until the people who wrote them died. A lot of personal narratives. And as they were discovered or uncovered, they were made known to the public. Probably the most popular, most well-known was the Diary of Anne Frank, but there were many diaries, collections of letters, and autobiographical material, and it has been added to since then. So this is, what am I talking about? I'm talking about possibly, now that I've reread it, one of the most profound, if not the most profound books I've ever read. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I'm quite sure it was written in 1945, so I'm quite sure he included women in this. You will see that it's divided into two sections. The first section is autobiographical narrative of his experience as a prisoner in the concentration camp. The second half of the book are his philosophical conclusions from that experience. And it's absolutely profound, his take on the whole thing. And I think it's the perfect book for this time and place for us. This book will, I believe, for me anyway, give us the tools to deal with what's going on. Give us perspective for why this situation is devolving the way it is. And it'll give us hope for humanity in general. So let's just jump into it. Now, it's been 3 weeks since I read this. I've been really working on this stuff. And so if I forget what I'm talking about when I'm reading it, it's because it's been a while, in one ear, out the other. So, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, written in 1945. I don't believe that there is a blurb about, no, there's no blurb about him personally, but I do know that he was an Austrian psychiatrist, analyst in Vienna, and knew a lot of famous psychologists and philosophers of the time. So he was in a unique position to observe aberrant behavior, or was it aberrant? It's hard to say. So in his own words, he describes this as a book of survival. He felt that he was a brand plucked from the fire. He said that this is less about his suffering than about the source of his strength. And that's what's so remarkable about this. And he quotes Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." He observed firsthand that prisoners who gave up hope were the first to die, that they lacked something to live for. What did he use? He said that he kept himself going day by day with thoughts of his wife. They were separated at the gates of the concentration camp. And with preparing lectures in his head for after the war about the psychological lessons that he was learning from Auschwitz. And he said that the real question that needs to be asked about all of this Holocaust, is not why did they die, but why did anyone survive? Frankl concluded that he did not agree with Freud, who believed that life is a quest for pleasure and power, and that that's what causes, just a quest for pleasure, and that that's what causes the tensions that create neuroses, emotional problems. That was Freud's very basic idea. He didn't agree with Adler, who believed that life was a quest for power, and that struggle is what caused issues in people's lives. He believes, he concluded, that life is a quest for meaning. That the greatest task of life is to find meaning, and there are 3 sources of meaning. You can find meaning in your work, and it doesn't have to be for pay, just in the work that you do. You will find meaning in love, and it can include the love of the arts, not just the love of people, although that's important, but it can include the love of beauty and the love of art, love of music. And the 3rd source of meaning is to be able to find inner courage in the face of difficulty. Suffering itself, he says, is meaningless. Of course it is. But how we respond to it gives it meaning. And this is the crux of this book. And he says, at one point, Frankl writes that a person may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. He concedes that only a few prisoners of the Nazis were able to do the former. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. Finally, Frankl's most enduring insight, that the guy who's writing the introduction said that he used in his own life, forces beyond your control can take away everything that you possess except one thing: your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in your life, but you can always control what you will feel and do about what happens to you. And I feel, for me personally, this, since 2015 specifically, and the addition of COVID and the quarantine, and doing this channel, has been a deepening quest for me to try to decide how to think about what's going on. Do I just climb into bed with chocolates and die? Because that's my first impulse, always. It's my solution to everything. Do I piss and moan, which is my secondary solution, often hand in hand with the first, and drive everybody around me insane, which is why I started this channel, to give the rest of the people in the world a break, the people in close proximity? Or do I do something else? And what is that something else? And talking back and forth with viewers, listening to people's commentary, meeting what a variety of remarkable people. Some of them conversations on the video here, some of them personal give and take. And then time spent in contemplation has afforded me the opportunity to decide what my priorities are and how I'm going to respond. Because when Trump became president, I thought it was over. I really did. And some things may still be over. but for some weird reason, it no longer gives me absolute existential despair and dread. Somehow, I've been able to attain a sense of perspective. And this book was the icing on the cake. This book solidified the ideas that have been roiling around in my head now for a couple of years. They've given them structure and meaning. So let's continue. So he discusses a scene from a play by Arthur Miller called Incident at Vichy. The Vichy government was, for anyone who might not know, if you're a teenager, although I can't imagine that you'd be watching this if you're a teenager, but the Vichy government was the parallel government in France that the Nazis allowed the French to run by themselves, but it was a puppet government. It was in the south of France, and the Nazis, invaded France and occupied the country, but they threw them a bone and let them do this government in the south, but fairly meaningless and considered traitorous by the resistance. So Arthur Miller wrote a play about it, The Incident at Vichy, where an upper middle class professor shows a Nazi his credentials, his degrees and everything. And the Nazi says to him, "Is that all you have?" And he throws them in the trash. And then he looks at the professor, he says, "Good, now you have nothing." So we're never left with nothing if we retain the freedom to choose how we will respond. That's the weapon we all possess, if you want to talk about it in military terms. That's the tool we have. It's our gift, our free will, our freedom of choice. And that's something that nobody can take away from you, because even if they throw you in a prison cell, how you mentally respond and how you deal on a day-to-day basis with that situation is something that they simply cannot take away from you. So he said that many retirees have this sense of nothing to do because their career was their source of meaning. And people with great affections saw a point in that, like relationships. They would see a point in that, and then when the relationships fell apart, they would feel like they had lost their meaning. And he invented a term for his approach because he was a therapist and returned to practicing that after the war. He calls this logotherapy, and which is curing the soul by leading the soul into finding meaning in life. So when people came to him with issues, that was the approach he took. So sometimes he says that his book is seen as a psychological book, but now he says it's more often seen as a spiritual book. Now this book was updated, and he updated it before he died, I think 1920. It was updated a number of times. So most of it was written in his head and at the end of the war, so in the 40s. Then it was finally published in the late 50s. Then it was redone, and every time it was redone, he added to it. So it's a little difficult to pin down each passage to a certain date because it evolved. His point of view is that life has meaning despite our circumstances, no matter how grim. And that he does believe in an ultimate purpose to life. In 1992, he wrote a preface to the new edition, and he says, well, he was shocked that this book became a bestseller. And he said it became a bestseller because so many people reach out for it during the misery of their time, whatever the misery of the time happens to be. So part one is about the concentration camp, and it validates the conclusions of part two. And part two is about his practice of logotherapy. This book was written in 9 days, which is just incredible. But that's not entirely true because he was working on it in his head. But it was pen to paper, start to finish, 9 days. And originally he wanted to publish it anonymously. He didn't want the attention to be on him. So his point of view is that life holds potential meaning even under the most miserable of conditions. And he doesn't spend a lot of time, he's not coming at this from per se religious points of view. He's not ascribing pain, misery, and suffering to an angry God or things you've done wrong in your past or a test from the universe. None of that. He's not asking the why. He's asking how to make it purposeful and meaningful rather than just plain old miserable. He wanted the book to be helpful to people who were prone to despair. And he wanted to be anonymous because he wasn't looking for success. He says, success like happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And what does it ensue from? To me, this is the most profound thing. In fact, I told this to my neighbor the other day, and he was completely blown away. So let me find the page here. For success like happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. I want you to listen to what your conscience commands you to do and go on to carry it out to the best of your knowledge. Then you will live to see that in the long run, I say, success will follow you precisely because you had forgotten to think of it. I just think that that's profound, that you cannot seek happiness. And you notice that a lot, especially in young people. You ask them, what do you want from life? Oh, I just want to be happy. Well, great, but you can't go looking for happiness. You have to find a purpose, a meaning, and happiness will come. So Frankl's dilemma was, before the United States entered the war, he was notified that he had been given a visa to immigrate to the United States. But he had this dilemma. Should he leave his parents back home in Austria to their fate because he saw the writing on the wall? And he could go to the United States and produce this brainchild, his great theories. He had a whole manuscript written out and ready to go. And or should he concentrate on his duties as a real child, do everything to protect his parents? He couldn't decide. And one day he was talking to his dad, and he saw a piece of marble on his father's table. And he asked his father, well, why do you have this chunk of dirty old marble sitting on your table? And his father said that this was something he picked up on the street after the Nazis had burned a synagogue, and it was the only thing that was left. And that on this chunk of marble, there was a tiny part of one of the 10 Commandments, and it was in Hebrew. And Frankl asked his father, well, what does it say? And it says, honor thy father and thy mother. So, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. So he decided to stay with his parents, and he let his visa to the United States expire. Can you imagine? So he said that his experiences in the concentration camp, often you'll read stories about the concentration camp, and they do focus on the dramatic, really egregious things. And he said I mean, you can't compare, suffering, but an equally awful part of life in a concentration camp is that on a day-to-day basis, on an hour-by-hour basis, you are concerned with a multitude of small torments. So how was everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of the average prisoner? And so he took stories that he was familiar with on a personal level, mostly from smaller camps, and most did have an extermination program. He said, this is about suffering and deaths of the unknown and the unrecorded, common, everyday prisoners, ordinary people, nobody heroic. Now, capo, I believe I'm pronouncing that, I hope I am properly. A capo was a prisoner who'd been elevated to a position of authority over the other prisoners. They were kind of like the RAs of the dormitory. They were the people in charge of the particular what's it called, barracks that they were in. And they were usually picked from the worst. The capos hated the prisoners, and because that made them feel superior. And they were most brutal of everybody in the camp, and many capos lived better in the camp than they had in their former lives. These were picked from the least educated, the most psychopathic, the most vicious and sadistic. They were often worse than the SS. The SS considered themselves effete and did not want to dirty their hands, although they were brutal too, but the capos did the real dirty work. And they were chosen for this reason, and they were also brutalized more by the Nazis because they were punished if they weren't hard. So he said that every day life was a struggle for daily bread. And for example, on the transport, they were told they were being transported, and it said often when this would happen, they were really sent to the gas chamber. The sick and the feeble that went to the camp went to the gas chamber and the crematorium immediately, and there was a selection process as they got off the train. And what he said these books don't often talk about is the fact that the selection process itself would trigger a fight between the prisoners to not be put on the wrong list, and a certain number had to go. This was the odd thing about the Nazis, except for the ones who were particularly sadistic like Mengele, or had like an agenda like Mengele. Most of them simply had to fulfill a roster. They had a number of people that could go into the camp and a number of people who had to be done away with from the sum total they knew they were dealing with on the trains. They didn't really care. Yes, they needed workers, and so that created part of the selection. But after that, they didn't care who the workers were as long as they could work. One prisoner was the same as the other as far as they were concerned. So they're much more concerned about the accounting. Everyone was only a number, and each prisoner was only concerned with saving himself and possibly a friend or two. So it was this horrible fight for survival. Those who survived had learned to set aside scruples in their fight to live. Ordinary morals went out the door. They were prepared to use any means to stay alive themselves, including betraying friends. And his quote, which is really interesting, is, "The best of us did not return." He felt that this whole thing is hard to describe because you need some objectivity, which he doesn't have, but you also need experience, which he's got plenty of. And he says it's very difficult to write about this because it's difficult to avoid personal bias. It's difficult to justify your own behaviors and decisions. Hard for him to be 100% honest in telling the story, reveal things about himself and others that he didn't like. So at this point, he was employed digging and laying railroad tracks, and he had to help dig a tunnel for a water main in the process of doing this. And they would be hired out to businesses outside the concentration camp. So he was working for a private boss, and they all were. And this boss, sometimes the bosses were awful, and sometimes they were marginally okay. And this one boss allowed them to earn what were called premium coupons. They were issued by the construction company. Basically, they were slaves. And these coupons were worth about 50 pennies each, which was the equivalent of 6 cigarettes or 6 soups. The company paid the concentration camp, $1 a day for the prisoners, and then passed out these coupons that they probably paid the money to the concentration camp for too. So if you saw prisoners smoking, he says, you knew that the prisoner had given up on eating and therefore had given up on surviving. They used cigarettes as a unit of exchange, money. They didn't really smoke them much because they were too desperate for food. So when people started prioritizing smoking and had given up on eating, then that was it. They were lost. They said there were 3 phases of inmate their mental reaction to being in the camp. So when they were admitted to the camp, they were in shock, and the shock often began before their arrival because they would be stuck on these trains for days without food or water or toilets. People were dying. It was just dreadful. He came on a train, and there was room for 200 people on this train, and there were train car, and there were 1,500 crammed into it, and they were in it for several days and nights. There were 80 people per car, 1,500 in total over a few cars, and there was only room for 200 total between the whole thing. So 80 people shoved inside this car that should probably have held, I don't know, a third of that, a fourth of that. So they had to sit on top of their luggage, they had to stand, take turns, and only the top of the windows were unexposed because of the stacking of luggage. And they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what country they were going to. They didn't know if they were going to be killed or if they were going to be going to work or if they were going to be separated from their families. So there's this horrible anticipation. They were each given a 5-ounce chunk of bread to last them for 4 days. Nothing else, no water, nothing. When they finally stopped, they saw the sign for Auschwitz and they knew what it meant. And they were absolutely horrified. And it took a while to drive the approach to the camp because it was huge. You think of, I always think of just that Arbeit mit frei, I think is how you pronounce it. Work will set you free, wrought iron gate, and then barracks. But no, this thing went on for miles and miles and miles and miles. He said the doors would be flung open, and the first thing they saw was a group of prisoners in striped pajama-type things with their heads shaven and speaking many languages. They looked well-fed. They were joking around with each other. So then their next thought, well, they were shocked, but surely it would be okay. These prisoners don't seem particularly stressed out. He calls this a psychological protective mechanism called the delusion of reprieve. It's the shred of hope that you retain. You don't know what you're really looking at, and you're trying to assure yourself that survival is possible. They didn't realize they were looking at a special unit of prisoners. And the newcomers tried bribing these prisoners in this unit. They had luggage with them. They had alcohol in the luggage, I guess, and they tried bribing them. And what they didn't realize was that these prisoners looked well-fed because they were well-fed. And they were well-fed because they were kept for a period of time. And they were a unit of prisoners who processed the unloading of the new prisoners, told them which line, where to go, and were also responsible for loading bodies out of the gas chamber into the crematorium. They were told to leave their luggage and form 2 lines, 1 line of men, 1 line of women. And then these lines filed past the SS officers. Frankl was losing his mind at this point because he had brought with him the manuscript for his life's work, this book that he had written. And he could not lose it. It was the only copy. And he had it in a bag, like a cloth bag, under his coat, and he couldn't part with it. So he was freaking out that someone would see that he had this bag tucked under his armpit, under his coat. So the SS officer was casually pointing people to the right and people to the left. And most of the prisoners were unaware of what this meant, but about 90% of them were sent in the direction to the bath, which was the gas chamber, to their death, 90%. Later on, when Frankl asked one of the older prisoners where his friend was that he had come with, the guy he asked, the older prisoner he asked, pointed to a chimney stack with smoke coming out and said, your friend's up there floating up to heaven. They were made to run from the station where the train stopped through the camp to be cleansed. So still this illusion of reprieve, everything's going to be okay. If they're going to give us a bath, everything's going to be okay. And the SS seemed just charming and very primped up. You know, they were all very neat as pins and clean and formal. And they also cajoled watches and jewelry, the SS did, out of the prisoners. They spread blankets on the ground, and they told the prisoners, throw your valuables on these blankets, throw everything on the ground. And many people, just didn't get the idea that what they meant by that, and tried to keep things, and they were marched off immediately. Frankl took an older prisoner aside and told him that he needed to save this manuscript. And this is terrible. The prisoner looked at it and just looked at him and said, shit. And meaning that's what it is. And at that point, the SS announced you have 2 minutes to undress and make it snappy. And take only your belt, your suspenders, and your shoes. And then they began to whip them to get them to comply. They were shaved 100% over their body, given a shower, and then I have something to read here. Let's see what it is. So later he was going to try to his glasses, he tried to trade them for a piece of bread. So there was an extra bit of excitement in store for the owner of trusses, like for hernias. They're just like support belts. In the evening, the senior prisoner in charge of our hut welcomed us with a speech in which he gave us his word of honor that he would hang personally from that beam, and he pointed to it, any person who had sewn money or precious stones into his truss. Proudly, he explained that as a senior inhabitant, the camp laws entitled him to do this. Oh. So those with good shoes had to give them up, and they were given shoes that didn't fit. Those who had cut down their boots, seeing the writing on the wall, I don't know why they would cut down their boots, because I guess they weren't allowed to keep boots, so they cut them down so that they looked like shoes, were whipped. At that point, he said, this weird sense of humor and a kind of a cold curiosity overwhelmed most of them. He said, this is a mental protection. You're anxious to know what's next. You're cold, you're wet, you're naked, standing outside in the cold air. And as a doctor, he said he began to realize that all his textbooks had lied that you could survive without sleep because it had been so long since he'd been able to lie down and sleep. He said that the whole notion that we have, I cannot live without XYZ, none of that is true. They slept in 6.5 to 8 foot bunks in tiers, and they slept on hard boards, people to a bunk. 9 people to a bunk. They had 2 blankets, and sometimes people would sneak their shoes up to use it as pillows, but they'd be beaten if it was discovered. Their shoes were supposed to be kept down below. They would lie side by side, and everybody would have to turn over at exactly the same time. He was unable to brush his teeth, and he said it's interesting that they had severe vitamin deficiencies, yet their gums were good the whole time. He never had any trouble with his gums, and he noticed that was true for most of them. A lot of things shut down. It's very weird. He wore the same shirt for 6 months. He was unable to bathe for days and days and days at a time, but he didn't have infections in the sores that he got, and he got a lot of sores. He said there were no light sleepers in the barracks, that when they went to bed, they all went to sleep immediately. He said a person can get used to anything. Everyone thought about suicide. They were hopeless. There was death everywhere, all around them, the danger of death all the time. On the first night, he promised himself that he would not run into the wire. It was surrounded camp by an electrified wire fence, and people killed themselves by just running into it and being done with it. He said there was really no sense in it. Your life expectancy in camp was so short anyway, it seemed a bit pointless. He knew he was in shock. He wasn't afraid of the gas. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was just numb. His friend arrived weeks earlier and got himself smuggled into Frankl's hut at night. And he was so thin that Frankl didn't recognize him. And his friend gave him a few words of advice. He said, don't fear the selections. They would come through and pick out the most sick-looking, weak-looking prisoners on a fairly regular basis and kill them. He said, don't be afraid of them. Shave every day. You'll look younger, and your cheeks will look redder. You'll look healthier, and you'll look fit for work. All you need to do is look fit for work. Don't limp, even if you have a blister. And they called people that were beyond the point of emaciation and weakness Muslims. I guess they said they looked like the old stereotype of a Swami in a turban. I mean, I know that this is all culturally completely wrong, but we're talking about what went on in the concentration camp. That they had this stereotype of people who had been fasting and meditating and looked very, 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 very thin. They called them Muslims because they were sick and unable to work anymore, and they were taken to the gas. He said an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. The greater normality you have in your life, in your brain, in your sense of sanity, the greater your abnormal reaction will be. So the first phase is this sort of shock, which then turns to a kind of a numb situation. And then the next phase is relative apathy. He said it's kind of an emotional death. It's the deadening. It's the result of the incomprehensible. You have a boundless longing for home and family and routine, and a boundless disgust for the dirt and the ugliness, the rags you're wearing, the human filth. They got beaten for wiping it off. They witnessed abuse and torture and death all over the place every day, and you're not able to feel disgust, horror, empathy, or pity anymore. You go into a sort of emotional numbness and apathy. And suffering simply could not move him anymore because everything was suffering. You numbly watch the removal of bodies from the barracks. It's a blunting of emotion. He felt he could not care anymore. He just could not. He had reached his limit. And this insensitivity was a protective shell. It was your mind protecting yourself. He said beatings were constant and often for no reason, so it's almost impossible to avoid them because they were random. In a bread line, a guy wasn't exactly behind the guy in front of him, and the lack of symmetry upset the SS guard, and he was beaten. He said the mental agony of the whole situation was far worse than the physical agony. It was dehumanizing to be beaten for nothing, you know, like, hey, I'm a nice guy, I'm a nice person, I haven't done it. What is your beef against me? And this sort of dehumanizing on an epic scale. For example, he'd be working, shoveling gravel, and just from boredom, the guard would throw gravel at him, throw stones at him, and it was just like, hey, you know. The most painful part was the insult that all of this implied, the lack of caring about them as people. He had been befriended by a capo who confided in him for relationship advice because he was a psychiatrist, and this capo found out he was a psychiatrist, so he plugged into him for his therapist at the camp, and it afforded Frankl a place to stand next to the capo, which helped him to avoid being beaten by the guards because they didn't lash out at the capos. They needed them. And the capo occasionally got him a better bowl of soup. So instead of just scooping the water on the supposedly soup, he would scoop it from the bottom where the chunks, if there were any, of whatever were available. But he said this kind of all-pervasive apathy was really a self-protection. It was necessary for self-preservation, and your own survival becomes your only focus. You're forced to retreat into a more primitive mental life, a regression. Your real mental and emotional life emerges in your dreams, and you dream about food, you dream about baths, you dream about cigarettes. His dire desire for food, all the prisoners said, was a major primitive instinct around which their mental life centered. They talked about food all the time. He always thought that this food obsession was actually a physiological threat because it would make you hungry, and he tried not to engage in it. Near the last near the last days of being, like before the end of the war, of prison, in one day they would receive one bowl of watery soup, a tiny ration of bread, and maybe an extra allowance of something else, which could be like 3/4 ounces of margarine, or one slice of sausage, so-called sausage is how he put it, or a small piece of cheese, or a spoon of synthetic honey or jam. And he said the calories were completely inadequate. They were working really, really hard, and they didn't have adequate clothing, and it was cold, and they were living in unheated barracks. They weren't getting enough sleep. The calories were just inadequate. They were able to predict who would die next based on the amount of emaciation and deterioration, they said. They longed for food to hold on to the belief that that the subhuman existence that they were going through would one day cease. That's how they kept themselves going with those thoughts. He said it was a soul-destroying mental conflict and a clash of willpower while laboring, waiting for a break from working. He would have broken a small ration of bread and stuck it in his pocket earlier, and he would try not to think about it, and it would torture him mentally constantly, and he'd be going all day debating with himself when he was going to eat it. Will I eat it now? Will I save it for later? Will I eat little crumbs off and on all day? It became this enormous debate. They had many debates. If you eat it right away, you take care of the hunger pangs for like all of the hunger pangs for like a moment, and you can keep it from being stolen, or you can divide it up and sort of eat little bits all day long, but there are risks to that too. He said the most ghastly moment in camp was always when you woke up and you realized, oh my God, another day. Uh, they all lost their libido. They lost their sentiment about things. He said it was kind of a cultural hibernation, music, art, literature, poetry, all was just non existent, except for two issues: politics and religion. He said people debated them endlessly. Uh, there were political rumors fed by their loss of hope or fed by what he called incorrigible optimism, and people would argue about politics. Religious interests were intense and sincere. People prayed and had services in corners. Other people wanted to debate the existence of God. He said typhus was rampant and it caused deliriums, and he avoided sleep so that he wouldn't fall into a delirium. He tried to recreate his manuscript that he lost. He found little scraps of paper, and he would write in shorthand notes to remember parts of his manuscript and hang on to that. He said scientific debates were common. There was even a spiritualist seance. So a clerk wrote VAL, VI, which was abbreviation for Latin. It meant Val Victus or Val Victus, woe to the vanquished. And this is the phrase that came out during the seance. Like they had a seance, and the person who was the spiritualist said these words. Interestingly enough, he knew no Latin. They had to ask somebody who knew Latin, what did that mean? And said, oh, I recognize that. That is Latin, and it means woe to the vanquished. And shortly thereafter, the war ended. So, I don't know, who knows? So what Frankl observed from all of this is that people who had a rich inner life suffered less. They could retreat inward, and it gave them spiritual freedom. And it was a paradox that often seemingly less hardy prisoners did better because they had an inner life. And I think I've observed that about the pandemic. People who were able to find resources within and not struggle so much without have seemed to have fared better. It's just an observation. On the forced march that was put on them at the end when they were evacuating the camp, he kept himself going with putting the image of his wife in his mind, and he just kept having conversations in his head with her as he marched along to remove himself from the reality of what they were going through at the moment. And a thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. In the position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his suffering in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory." While he was working, he said, my mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she were still alive. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, his inner self. Whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. The intensification of his inner life helped him find a refuge from the the emptiness and the desolation and the spiritual poverty around him. He could escape into the past and into nostalgia for small things. His nostalgic memory glorified them, and they assumed a strange character. Their world and their existence seemed very distant, and the spirit reached out for them longingly. In my mind, I took bus rides, unlocked the front door of my apartment, answered my telephone, switched on the electric lights. Our thoughts often centered on such details, and these memories could move one to tears. He appreciated the beauty of art and nature more, and it gave him hope. He said, looking at the scenery on the transport train, like the mountains in the setting sun. And then he quotes this saying, et lux in tenebris lucet, which means, and the light shines in the darkness. Et tenebrae eam non comprehenderunt, and the darkness did not comprehend it. This is from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, verse 5. So what was their art, you might ask? They had a cabaret for those with good positions, so not everybody could be involved. The ones that had jobs that kept them with some energy and free time, they did songs, poems, jokes. It helped everybody forget what was going on. He got a friend to agree that they would tell each other one funny story every day and make up something that might happen one day after liberation. So this is the kind of thing they told each other. My friend, he was a surgeon and had been an assistant on the staff of a large hospital. So I once tried to get him to smile by describing to him how he would be unable to lose the habits of camp life when he returned to his former work. On the building site, especially when the supervisor made his tour of inspection, the foreman encouraged us to work faster by shouting, "Action, action." I told my surgeon friend, one day you will be back in the operating room performing a big abdominal operation, and suddenly an orderly would rush in announcing the arrival of the senior surgeon by shouting, "Action, action." Sometimes the other men invented amusing dreams about the future, such as forecasting that during a future dinner engagement, they might forget themselves when the soup was served and beg the hostess to ladle it from the bottom. So the art of living was partly developing a sense of humor. He said suffering is like a gas. It'll fill a human soul completely, and therefore you have to take up some of that room in your soul with humor. Small things were huge. They had an indescribable sense of joy when the train got to a fork in the road and they knew that one went to Dachau and one went to Mauthausen, which was the death camp. And their train went the way away from the death camp. And he said they celebrated. Here they are in a concentration camp transport, and they celebrated. Because they heard that there was no oven in the camp where they were going. They were able to take solace from being glad to not have a worse job when they were in camp. They even felt relief at a raid, even though the air raid was dangerous, but it got them away from a brutal foreman on that particular job. He said he was saved by the bell of bombing. So they were grateful for small mercies. They learned to take pleasure and notice small mercies. They were happy when they had enough time to delouse themselves before they went to bed, because it was a negative happiness. It was a freedom from suffering. And he said at one point in his head he tried to make a list of pleasures, and he said he was only able to come up with 2 in 2 weeks. So he had to focus on the negative happiness. He volunteered to help on a typhus ward with a doctor friend, And they looked so bad, so weak, that when they got there, the doctor in charge arranged for them to get extra food so they wouldn't die, so that they could help him take care of all these patients. It's just such a cognitive dissonance that they're killing people outside and yet they're taking care of patients inside. It's just bizarre. So anything connected to, not connected to staying alive, lost all of its value. And personal ego lost its sense of value because the world no longer recognized the value of human life, because there was no human dignity, and because they had a loss of will. So they had to struggle to maintain their self-respect, or they would lose their sense of self. They'd lose the sense of being individuals with a mind and inner freedom and personal value. That was a huge struggle to maintain that in their heads. He said people did descend into animal-like behavior, just part of the mass of humanity. They were herded like sheep. They were watched by dangerous pack, like wild dogs, the guards. They had only two thoughts: how to avoid the pack, how to get food. He always tried to be in the middle of the group to avoid the blows and the whip and also the cold wind. And his rule was, do not be conspicuous, avoid attracting the SS attention. He really craved being alone with himself and his thoughts. He really craved privacy and solitude. And he found a spot under the hut with a makeshift tent where they kept the daily corpses as they accumulated. And he would escape there alone, except for the dead, for 5 minutes of peace. He just needed to be away from people. If a number of sick were to be moved, who they were really didn't matter. So the total number just had to be correct, and it didn't matter who the individual people were. Camp inmates were afraid to make decisions. Every decision might be a matter of life and death. Do I stay? Do I go? Do I volunteer? Do I keep quiet? They didn't want to take any kind of initiative, became fatalistic. They decided to just let things happen without their participation in the decision making. This is this apathy. Life or death decisions, he said the tortures of hell often were the tortures of hell. They often had only a few minutes to decide what to do, and it could mean everything, like the opportunity to escape, or should I go into a transport, all the way to the end. He said they were faced with these decisions. And apathy that they suffered was also caused by hunger, not only emotional, mental protection, but by hunger and lack of sleep, and the inability to the irritability to get rid of the vermin, and the lack of hygiene, and also just no coffee, no caffeine, no nicotine. And all the prisoners were dealing with this loss of sense of an inner self, of being somebody and being treated like non-entities. The consciousness of inner value is anchored in a higher and more spiritual things, and that can't be shaken by camp life. But how many possess the ability to tap into it? We all have it. We all have an inner value. We're all aware that we have an inner value. But for very many people, it was lost in this existence. And he knew from his training, he knew that he had to be able to hang on to that to survive. He said that the prisoners felt degraded, and prominent prisoners didn't feel degraded. They were cooks and capos and prisoners chosen to be cops. That they had this delusion of grandeur. They had status that had nothing to do with their status in real life, and it kept them from giving in to despair. The mental reaction of the envious and the grumbling majority towards this favored minority found expression in several ways, sometimes in jokes. For instance, I heard one prisoner talk to another about a capo saying, "Imagine, I knew that man when he was only the president of a large bank. Isn't it fortunate that he has risen so far in the world?" When the degraded and the promoted came into conflict, there was often explosive violence, and this violence was fueled by the endless violence that they saw around them. So much contradiction. He said that he was in this typhus ward taking care of patients, and they had to keep it clean. But they had to keep it clean, keep dirty, ragged blankets clean and tucked in. Not, washed, but neat, tucked in, even though they were filthy rags. Did they have any freedom of choice about how to act, or did their surroundings determine their behavior? He determined, yes, they had a choice, that apathy could be overcome, irritability could be suppressed, and you can preserve your vestige of spiritual freedom and mental independence if you determine that you're going to do that. And there were those who just gave comfort, and their last bit of bread, like he said, the best of us did not return. People who really gave the last of what they had, comforted those around them. And he said that was proof to him that we will always have a choice of attitude. We can't always choose our own way. There were many opportunities to make those sorts of choices. Would you become a plaything of circumstance, renounce your freedom and dignity, or would you rise to the occasion? The sort of prisoner you become is the result of your inner decision. Every man can decide what shall become of him mentally and spiritually. You can retain human dignity, he said, but you have to make that active, conscious decision to do it. It has to be a choice. Dostoevsky said, "There's only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." These words frequently came to my mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their sufferings. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. You may have an active life and you might realize value in your work, or you may have a passive life and you can experience fulfillment in beauty and nature and art, or you can have purpose in a life barren of creativity and find meaning in suffering. And one possibility of high moral behavior is man's attitude to his existence, even when restricted by external forces. Not only creativity and enjoyment are meaningful. If life has meaning, then suffering has meaning, because suffering is an ineradicable part of life, as are fate and death. Without suffering and death, life cannot be complete. The way a human accepts his fate and its suffering gives ample opportunity to add deeper meaning to life. One can choose to be brave and dignified and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, one can forget his dignity and become no more than an animal. So I'm going to stop here, a little bit over an hour. And I'll upload this and I'll go on to make part 2. So by the time you finish this, part 1, part 2 might be ready. Sometimes they upload right away and sometimes it takes a while. I have no comprehension of what's going on, why that happens. I do believe it's magic. I have no other idea. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you're enjoying this book. I hope it is as profound for you as it was for me, because it has really shifted my perspective a lot in the past couple of weeks. I've thought about it a lot. Each of us is different. Things speak to some people and not others until maybe a different period of life or whatever. But I hope for those of you who are watching, I hope this book gives you the sense of hope it's given me. And I would recommend even though you're listening to this, I would recommend to get it and to read it and to underline the things in it that really resonate with you and to return to it, because even now, going back over it here, I'm really processing it more. So thank you for watching, and Sláinte, and I'll be back in a minute here with part 2.